As I usually do when I'm nervous, I'm just going to dive right in. If I were to ask you to tell me a story, would you interpret that request as a tale of fact or fiction? If I were to ask you to write a newspaper article, would you write it based on fact or fiction? If I ask you to tell my young granddaughter a story, would you base that on fact or fiction? My grandmother was known as a great storyteller, but no one could ever tell where the facts stopped and the fiction began. Merriam-Webster defines story with 8 different definitions. 1, history. 2, an account of incidents or events. 3, fictional narrative. 4, widely circulated rumor. 5, a lie or falsehood. 6, legend. 7, news article. 8, situation. I'm going to contend that there's no delineations in those 8 definitions, no clear delineation. It's all very muddy. Where does fiction end and truth begin? Several years ago, I was challenged to consider the idea that since we all have our own experiences and interpretations of all aspects of our lives, with each of us having our own colored lenses influencing our perceptions, that maybe we're all living different stories. My story of my experience in the last few minutes is going to be different from someone sitting in the next, few feet that maybe had a horrible headache or had a screaming child. But we all share the experience. All different, all changing, but perceived to us individuals as real. Maybe the vast majority of our lives, our attitudes, our perceptions would fall under the category of story. Remember the old parable from India of 6 blind men and an elephant? They were each asked to describe the elephant. The blind man, feeling the leg, described a pillar. The one feeling the ear described a fan. The one at the tail described a rope. The tusk was a hard, solid pipe. The trunk was like a tree branch, and the belly was like a wall. All were telling their truth, and they argued terribly. All different, but very true. Then there's changing perspective. Back in the 70s and 80s, we discovered that butter was so unhealthy, and we all went to margarine. Then in the 90s, we decided margarine wasn't healthy, so we went back to butter. And I'm not even going to touch the egg controversy, because today I have my own story that eggs are very healthy for us. So yes, I accept the concept, and I'm very comfortable with the idea that I live my story all the time. And I make up stories about other people all the time. My truth and my stories are real bedfellows, and I can rarely tell them apart. Does that degrade my truth if I refer to it as my story? If I question your experience and call it a story and ask if there could be another version, am I questioning your integrity? I don't believe so. It's not my intention. My point here today is that we're all human. No, we're actually all souls or spirits having a human experience. To me, that means that we're little pieces of God at our core, walking around with these egos plastered all over us, encased in a human body. So we all have our spiritual truth, but to get to it, we have to dig through layers and layers and layers of physical limitations and our senses and also our egos. Our stories are usually based on our egos, and we tell our stories about our egos, and we hear others' stories through our egos as filters. This happens all the time. Doug and I each have our own story about our children and how they should be living to prove that they're productive, healthy, happy human beings. So when we question their happiness to ourselves, of course, I often wonder what part of the story should be changed. Are they truly unhappy, or is it our story that's not being lived out? Would we be better changing our story rather than asking them to change or expecting them to change? And if our expectations, which are the stories that we made up based on our belief system, are perceived by them as judgments and non-supportive, how is that affecting the stories they tell themselves about themselves? How does that affect our relationship? Often our stories conflict, and therefore we are at conflict. What I'm learning about stories is not to stop telling them, not to stop listening to them. That's impossible. They are part of our nature. What we need to do is go deeper into the stories, listen closer, reflect longer, reach down into our core to listen and to tell. The deeper we go into the story, the closer we get to that core of godliness that's in each of us. My first awareness of a truly life-changing experience involving story occurred when I was learning the importance of getting dental patients to tell me their dental story in order to clarify their personal goals to their health. I'm not just referring to how often they'd gone to the dentist or what happened in the dental office. The significant connection happens when the story is told at a deeper level. In the office, we would start with questions such as, what were your parents' attitudes about their teeth and about going to the dentist? What do you expect of your teeth presently, and what do you expect of your teeth in the future? How have your past experiences influenced why you're here in the chair today? As the story goes deeper, the true barriers to reaching their good health can be recognized and sometimes overcome. At the time I was beginning to explore these techniques, I went home to Texas at Thanksgiving. And it was such perfect timing because my parents had just been informed that it was time for my father to go into hospice care. I was honored to be present when the hospice nurse, or Angel as I prefer to call her, came to introduce the concept and their services. She encouraged us to talk about our fears and hopes with honesty, patience, and love for each other. So I combined what I was learning on the professional level about stories with what she advised. One night I sat with my parents, both parents, and I asked my dad to tell his life story from the beginning. He did that over the next 4 hours. Much of it I had heard before, but this time I listened with love and respect. My God's ear, which was connected to my core of godliness, was definitely more open. All conflict that had ever existed between us fell away. I heard his story deeper this time. He told it deeper. The next 5 months leading to his death, we shared a sense of well-being that I cherish to this day. So I remind you to encourage others to tell their stories and to listen at a deep level and both listening and telling will be more effective and heartfelt from your godly core. We may never be able to get through all the ego stuff, but if we are intent and focused on reaching down to our God self, that will deliver the truest story possible. The importance of stories is obvious when we consider that our Bible is the staple of Christianity. Oral tradition of storytelling is what nurtures religious scholars and practicing Christians alike. I recently learned more of the Kabbalah interpretation of the story of Moses. Kabbalah is based on the oral and written traditions inspired by the mystical Jews. The Kabbalists claim that when Moses was described as slow of tongue in Exodus, as Steve just read in the scripture, that meant he stuttered and had a lisp. So we can imagine Moses' surprise when he was asked to be the leader and spokesman of God to the Israelites and Pharaohs. He was flabbergasted and he couldn't believe that what God was asking him to do. He kept putting God off. He put God off for a week. Every day he'd come up with a different excuse. But like many, he didn't direct his problem directly. The Kabbalist Michael Berg tells the story well. Quote, Moses decided it was time to bring up his speech problem with the Creator. Moses said, I'm supposed to go say to the Israelites, you've been in exile for generations and I'm the messenger. I am chosen one who can create the miracles of the world. What is the first thing they're going to respond? Oh, really? God created the heavens and the earth? He killed thousands of people and he can't fix your lisp and stutter? Do you have any idea how ridiculous this will be, God? The Creator replied, Moses, you should have had certainty. You should have had no doubt that I would heal you. But because you had doubt, you prevented the healing, and now you will continue to stutter and lisp, except for such times as I need you to speak for me. Close quote. And therefore, when Moses was speaking on behalf of God to the Israelites and Pharaoh, he did not stutter and was able to deliver the most powerfully moving and articulate speeches. But because he doubted God, he was not completely healed of his impediment. As all the Bible stories, the story of Moses has many lessons. This segment speaks of that epidemic emotion possessed by humankind, doubt. Doubt in ourselves and doubt in our Creator. The best tool I have for reaching down through my doubt to my deepest God self is prayer. I have to admit I'm not keen on prayer of petition or asking God specifically for things. I don't believe God gives us what we want or pray for when He chooses to or who He chooses to give it to. What prayer does for me is help me recognize my ego layers of doubt, the self-importance, or fear of all kinds. Prayer tears through them and adds clarity in my seeing and being my God core. The part of me truly intended for sharing is identified in prayer. The parts such as my patience, knowledge, talents, compassion, love, and understanding. That's what getting in touch with God did for Moses. When he was speaking on behalf of God, he could speak his truth with clarity. When Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, pray without ceasing, he's giving encouragement to never give up, to never doubt. He's not advising to stay on bended knee all the time. Instead, he's saying stay in touch with God's core and awareness of our egos, and how there are thick layers keeping us from really listening to God and others. We can hear God both through our own hearts and through others. Listening to others' stories may be challenging at times, but God's always speaking. And often it's through others' stories that we might hear our Almighty Creator. We can't leave out our own denomination's byline. United Church of Christ proudly proclaims, God is still speaking. As I move into the latter half of my life, deeper connections with others give me my meaning to live. Through prayer and discerning my truth, my stories get deeper and deeper, and the meaning of life gets richer. Please give me an opportunity to hear your stories, both past and present, both godly and ungodly. I want to hear how you connect to your godly core and to others. Let us continue to practice listening and hearing each other's stories in that prayerful posture so we can strengthen our connections as we move toward God's truth. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my Redeemer.